My name is Antoinet Smits and I work for the government agency RVO in the Netherlands. I've been involved in the behavior project for a long time and I'm still part of the behavior insight team of RVO. I'm glad to see so many of you here. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to our workshop, The Road to Net Zero, What Can Energy Agencies Learn from Behavior Science? I'm pleased that so many of you are here. We have a broad representation of policymakers, energy agencies and researchers, all vital actors in bringing about the sustainable energy transition. We will clearly not succeed if we don't take into account the necessary behavior and lifestyle changes in our policies and technologies. Okay, before we start, most of you know the drill. Mute your microphone, switch off your camera, and if you have questions, put them in the chat. As you can see on the program, the main part of our time we will spend on the 3 sessions that deal with key issues of behavioral science. Each chair of the session will give a pitch about the content in a few minutes. Before we go there, we will have a brief introduction of ENR and its working group on behavior from Irmeli Mikkonen. Irmeli is from Motiva and she has been involved in a variety of behavioral activities over a long period of time. And before I give her the floor, I would like to introduce to you our speakers of today. We have Dr. C. Rotmann joining us from New Zealand. She is a marine ecologist by training and behavior expert by calling. She's been running international research collaboration on behavior for the International Energy Agency for over a decade now. And she's currently focusing on hard to reach and vulnerable energy users. We will hear from her more in a few minutes. Then we have Dr. Gerdin De Vries. She's a climate psychologist who studies the energy transition and climate adaptation from a behavioral perspective. She identified psychological mechanisms that influence sustainable behavior from a multi-actor perspective. She also designs and evaluates policies that apply behavior insights. And last but not least, we will have Mr. Edouard Toulouse from France, who is an independent consultant specialized in environmental performance of products. He's growingly involved in the topic of energy sufficiency and one of the founders and leaders of ENOUGH, the International Network for Sufficiency Research and Policies. That's it for my part for now. I wish you all a very good workshop, and I'd like to pass on the floor to my friend and colleague, Irmeli. Irmeli, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Antoinette. Good morning to all of you from my side as well. Well, we know it goes without saying that behavioral and lifestyle changes are of utmost importance in achieving the energy transition. In order to sustain this transition, we cannot rely on technology and policies alone. We as humans have an increasingly important role to play in changing our behavior. Users' actions are key to the success of this challenging transition, and behavioral insights need to be taken into account in energy policies. Energy agencies are key players in engaging and supporting citizens in their countries on energy issues, and their role will become even more important in the years to come. There will be an increased need for education and awareness raising, advice and support to encourage greener energy choices, as well as behavior change programs to promote more sustainable habits. For those of you who may not be so familiar with the ENR network, we are a voluntary network of 25 national energy agencies in and outside the EU. We have responsibility for planning, management, and review of national research, development, demonstration, and dissemination programs. ENR is at the forefront of Europe's drive to improve energy efficiency, increase the use of renewable energy, and to mitigate the damaging effects of climate change, ensuring this transition is just. ENR acts as a bridge between national, regional, and local activities and those of the European community. Our main strengths include our unique, impartial perspective, our deep understanding of market and consumer needs, and our convening power. We have a strong track record in collaboration and innovation, cross-sectoral, multidisciplinary expertise, and practical experience of implementing government policies. This year, ADEME, the French Agency for Ecological Transition, holds the ENR presidency. The 2021 priority themes are aligned with the European Green Deal, focusing on the renovation wave with an emphasis on energy poverty and just transition, as well as on industry decarbonization within the framework of national recovery and resilience plans. Behavioral changes in these areas offer some of the greatest potential, from the improvement of energy efficiency at home to buildings renovation, but also to enhanced energy efficiency in the context of industry. The working group on behavior change is one of the 8 thematic working groups of the ENR. The next slide. Okay, there we go. Thank you. The ENR Behavior Change Working Group was established in 2005. Thank you, Antoinette, for being the power lady behind that. And we now have members from 15 ENR member organizations. The ENR network, as we all learned during these 2 days, has, through the Behavior Change Working Group, initiated and carried on co-organizing this biannual Behave conference since 2009. Our aim is to enhance knowledge on behavioral insights in programs and projects we deliver, and to add value to existing work of our members through communication, coordination, and collaboration of national activities and those of the European Commission and other relevant international bodies. Let me present you some of the actions we take to achieve this aim. We follow policy and program developments of the European Commission, like the European Green Deal, related to behavioral change and awareness raising. We also exchange information and share experiences related to behavior insights in campaign, program, and project delivery. We also design and implement joint projects to promote behavior change and bring about a significant reduction in energy end use amongst the EU population. Now we'd like to broaden our working group work and offer the Behavior Change Working Group as a platform for collaboration between the energy agencies, social scientists, and other relevant networks. We very much look forward to learn more on adapting behavioral sciences to enrich our work, and hopefully we can provide practice-oriented viewpoint in return to further research. Thank you for my part, and Sarah, I'll pass now the floor to you.
Kia ora, thank you. I am going to try and make this work. Just tell me quickly, can you guys see the screen and not the notes screen?
We can see it. It's good to see.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today about 2 research issues that I'm super passionate about. One of which is this introduction, which is around why it's really important to do multi-stakeholder collaboration, particularly between behavioral and social scientists and behavior changers, as I call you, such as yourselves. And the second one is going to be delving deeply into definitional issues around vulnerable energy users. And so without further ado, why would you want to collaborate? So in my almost decade of running this international research collaboration on behavior change, I've learned the hard way that clear definitions really matter. And so I'm going to start us off with some of them. The first one is collaboration, which is the process of 2 or more people or organizations working together to complete a task or achieve a goal. It is similar but not the same as cooperation. And so I'd like to point out some of those differences between coordination, cooperation, and collaboration, because they're often used in kind of the same way. But an example for coordination would be a web search result or conferences like this one. Cooperation examples are surveys or even voting, anything that aggregates individual inputs for societal gain. And collaboration examples are things like co-authoring or workshopping specific problems together. And what it really is about is the level of complexity, which you see there on the left. Yes? Sorry. Anyone want to say something? Can you still hear me? Is it all good?
Everything's excellent, T.
Okay. Sorry, I thought I heard somebody was trying to tell me that I was doing something wrong. So just for good measures, because we're talking about complexity, it's quite important to actually also understand the difference between complicated and complex systems, because they're also often used kind of in the same way. Many people believe that complexity is just a higher order of complicatedness, but in reality, they are totally different systems. And in systems theory, a system can be very complicated, but not complex at all. A system is complex when it has emergent behavior, such as self-organization, and complicated systems can be solved with enough computing power. Complex systems cannot be solved. So it's the difference between trying to pull apart and put together again a Boeing 747 versus doing the same with a jar of mayonnaise. One is definitely harder than the other, or impossible. I'm putting up this quote by Roberto Poli, because I really like it. And decision makers usually treat most problems as if they're complicated, i.e. that they have control over the outcomes and find solutions to problems. And unfortunately, it also means they quite often waste quite a bit of money on experts to give them the answers. And that explains sometimes where multi-stakeholder collaborations have a problem getting off the ground. And Roberto Poli's quote is good because it pertains to behavior change interventions as well. If we keep focusing on the individual in isolation of the wider system, we're doomed to keep failing. And so what he's saying down there, the relevant systems cannot be controlled. The best one can do is to influence them or learn to dance with them. And so I also, over the last 10 years or so or more, have had to learn how to dance with the behavior changes around the world that I started to work with. It was a bit of a hard journey to realize all these things, and I'm going to tell a wee bit of a story of how it all started with Task 24 in 2012 with our first big workshop at Oxford University that UKirk kindly co-funded. And I call it my trial by fire because I learned the hard way that what I stepped into, a group of highly credentialed social science experts from many different disciplines and sectors, and me as a newbie without relevant academic credentials, reputation, or merit. And so this photo of Elizabeth Shove merrily excoriating policymakers, including those sitting in the audience, for not reading her books on practice theories or understanding and utilizing practice theory in their work, is a good summary of how that initial workshop kind of kicked off. But what I did learn that was also really invaluable, and it set me on this journey to view behavior and how to change it through a much more complex lens, including the different people that you need to gather around to change behavior with. And Elizabeth at a dinner, actually, when she found out I was a coral reef ecologist, she said, I think you should have stayed in marine ecology. And at first I was quite offended by that, but I actually realized that it was probably some of the best advice that anyone could have given me, because my training in animal behavior and ecology is actually really useful to look at the energy system as well. And so I turned from coral reef ecology to behavioral socioecology. And so I want to share some of those hard-earned insights from this journey, and not just when I was trying to run the Extinction Rebellion in New Zealand in 2019, because I can definitely tell you something about human behavior from that experience. So insight number one, and you don't need to read this, this is just an example why, again, definitions are really important. It's not just about being clear about your terminology, but also to invite others, preferably from different disciplines and different perspectives and sectoral approaches to co-create definitions with you. These ended up being the definitions we used in Task 24 for 8 years. We really clearly defined in collaboration what we meant when we said energy behavior, behavior change, and who the behavior changers were who were changing behavior. The second insight I learned is there is definitely no answer. As behavioral scientists, we're often trained to think in models of understanding behavior or theories of change that all bring really invaluable insights and perspectives to the field. But when it comes to designing interventions in the field, Mr. Box still provides the best guideline there on how to treat any given approach being the answer for all the problems. There is good process to follow, however. We co-created this one with our project partners in the US, the Sea Change Institute, and it's a framework based on design thinking, together with really robust social science methodology, and it just helps you go through the steps of how to best design, implement, and evaluate a behavioral intervention. Even though it looks like a linear process, it actually goes beyond thinking in problems and solutions, and instead it goes to thinking about patterns and evolution in an open loop learning process. And so also what this does is, instead of promoting any specific model or theory or discipline, it actually provides a standardized, systematic, strategic design framework. And the bit I'd most like to focus on now is, for the rest of this presentation, is this first step, which is to start with your why. It sounds airy-fairy, but very often when we talk about our work, we jump immediately to the outcome or the product, which is the what, or we talk about the approach or the methodology, which is the how. But very often we don't work, especially not with the other stakeholders or behavior changes that we need together to really figure out what our shared why is. And my why, if you're interested, is focusing on the cause, not just the symptoms of dying coral reefs. And the cause, unfortunately, is human and corporate behavior and the system surrounding it. And so I'm right now doing exactly what I'm meant to be doing, I think. Working towards a collective impact, again, this is not rocket science at all, but you'd be surprised how few collaborations between different stakeholders do not actually start with setting a common agenda, which often actually takes quite a bit of compromise and really understanding each other's various mandates and restrictions and which stakeholders everyone has that they need to keep happy. Don't be afraid to get complex with it. So based on this idea of visualizing the socio-ecology of a given complex systems and its behavior changes in it, and the energy users and their context, we came up with this behavior changer framework for Task 24, and we tested it all around the world with hundreds of different behavior changes and in different sectors, and it worked really well to help with this gathering the right people and figuring out your why. What is, of course, also a big issue is figuring out who the right people are to get around the table. You need to be able to identify and engage the right behavior changes who help you change behaviors. And so you look around both internally in your organization and externally, and we created this kind of taxonomy of different behavior changes to try and identify them. It's also important to think beyond the meter and think about what people really care about. And unless they're electrical engineers, more likely than not, they don't care about kilowatt hours. Instead, if you're able to communicate your energy efficiency opportunities in a way that shows it will benefit other stakeholder needs, or particularly your audience needs, then you'll be more likely to get buy-in, engagement, and funding. It's also important to listen and understand their why. This is an example from a really successful pilot we did with the largest health network in North America. It was called the Energy Connect pilot with Atrium Health. And we talked to all the different actors or behavior changers in the hospital system, even though they didn't think of themselves as having anything to do with energy efficiency or behavior change. They actually all had a really important role to play. However, the one overarching mandate every single one of them agreed on when we talked to them was that there is nothing more important than patient care. And in order to do that, they needed 24/7 secure access to energy. And so energy efficiency really wasn't on the top of their mandate. And that was really important to understand when we tried to explain to them what we could do that would also actually help with fostering patient care. And largely, don't be afraid to share stories, including horror stories. This is a memorable quote that came from one of the building operators at the hospital. It kept being repeated again and again because it was so memorable. And it was part of a bigger horror story where the higher ups had a bit of a screw up because they bought in really expensive fault analytics software without discussing with the building operators first. And it was just a pretty expensive mistake, to be honest. And that's the kind of story that you want to learn from and share. And I hope that these insights haven't turned you off from working more closely with other behavioral scientists and other stakeholders, because Atrium Health, for example, they managed to win a whole bunch of awards, and they're saving up to $4 million in avoided energy costs every year now. And everyone's pretty happy that we did this pilot. And so thank you so much for your attention. And I really look forward to talking about vulnerable energy users soon as well. Cheers.
Thank you, Si. We are then giving you the floor. Gerdin, perhaps you can start with a pitch on your session.
Yes, so good morning, everybody, or I'm not sure if it's good morning for Si, but for me, it's morning. I'm Dr. No, I'm Dr. Gerdien De Vries, and I'm working at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. I am a psychologist working with behavioral insights in energy policy. So I study behavioral insights and I apply them. But above all, I am a psychologist, and I also like to stress that psychology is not the same as behavior change or behavioral insights. It's more than that, and it also covers, for instance, diagnostics. It also covers how the brain works, how reflexes works, how emotions works, etc. So I don't not only apply behavioral insights or study them, I also want to explain them and see why certain behavioral insights work and don't work when you use them in your energy policy. So in the session at 11, I think I'm in session 1, in Breakout Group 1, I will discuss behavioral insights and the relation with psychology, the do's and don'ts, where do you have to pay attention to if you, for instance, try to design tools for behavior change, what psychological mechanisms could hamper or could benefit your tools, and such alike. So I'm looking forward to meet you in session 1.
Excellent, Gerdin. Let me see. Edouard Toulouse, can I give you the floor to introduce your session?
Yeah, absolutely. I have just one slide to show, if it's possible. As it has been said, I am one of the founders of the ENOF network. That's an international network on sufficiency research. And I'll say a little more about the network in the breakout group. But now I just want to make a very brief introduction on this session on sufficiency. Sustainability requires that we answer our needs in a more ecological way, but our needs can and should also be questioned, and this is what sufficiency is about. So if I may use only one illustration, this is the picture you see on the graph, and this is how the average car has evolved. And of course, efficiency can seek how to make the technology inside the vehicle more and more efficient, but we can also wonder why we use such a way to answer our mobility needs, what drives these needs, and if other much less impactful ways would be possible. And so sufficiency is investigating how to organize societies in order to moderate the use of energy and material intensive services. And it's important to note that it's broader than individual behaviors and lifestyles, because the question can be relevant in any types of activity, organization, or policy sector. And obviously, human and social sciences are very relevant to contribute to sufficiency. They can provide insights on the conditions, barriers, and most effective ways to infuse the sense of sufficiency into all societal fields, such as ethics, education, economy, policies, marketing, and so on and so forth. We need sufficiency everywhere for it to deliver. A key step is also how sufficiency may be supported and implemented by relevant institutions and organizations. And energy agencies are amongst them. And I think it's very interesting and encouraging to see that, for instance, ADEME, the French energy agency, has started work to set up its sufficiency strategy alongside the efficiency. And we will hear about this in our breakout session. And we are also honored to have Joanne Wade as a speaker in our session. She has recently coordinated an extensive work on sufficiency policies at European level. So thanks, and looking forward to having you in our breakout group.
Thank you, Edouard. And then, can we get back to you for an introduction on your session?
Sure. As I said, I'll be talking about another one of my most favorite topics, which I think is super important, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic, and that is how to reach vulnerable energy users, who are a lot bigger audience group than we ever thought. We accidentally wrote a book on characterizing them during lockdown, and I want to share some of the issues, particularly around the many different definitions and terminologies, which we still haven't really settled on as a global community, and why it is, again, important to understand the right kind of definitions to use and how to characterize these groups and how to work with them, really, so we can engage them and help them, more importantly, and actually find a way of dealing with the underlying structural issues of inequity and energy injustice, without which I don't think we are going to have a sustainable or just energy transition. And so, yeah, that's what I'll be talking about, a lot slower than in that initial session, I promise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Okay, then I would like to invite our audience to go at the button below the screen. You can find the breakout rooms. Let me repeat, in breakout room 4C1, you can find Gerdin. In 2, you can find Edouard on sufficiency, and on 3, you can find C. We'll see you back here at 11:40, and then we'll get still a short report on all 3 sessions, so you won't miss anything. And also, the sessions will be recorded, so if you don't know how to choose, you will be able to see it at a later time. So I will see you back at 11:40 in this main room.
Okay, well, like I can see now we have 15 participants. So welcome to this breakout session on behavioural insights into energy policy making. We're very happy that you've chosen this session. And my name's Rebecca van Leeuwen from the Netherlands Enterprise Agency, RVO, and I'm part of the ENR network, which you heard about earlier this morning. So it's my privilege and pleasure to give the floor to Gerdin De Vries to give the presentation. And just to remind you, if you have any questions or any comments, please use the chat, and we will monitor the chat during the discussion. So we have until 20 to 12, so we have 40 minutes. So the floor is yours, Gerdin.
Yes. Can you give me a heads up in 30 minutes or so, that if I'm running over time, that I know if I'm running over time. Good morning again. I just gave the pitch. It's still morning. Welcome to have you here in my the session that I was given the opportunity to lead on behavioral insights in energy policy. So for the next 30 minutes, I will give a presentation. As Rebecca said, you can share your thoughts in the chat. I closed the chat so I can focus on the presentation. If there's anything important, Rebecca will warn me, and otherwise questions wait until the end. So who am I? I said I am a psychologist, but I do a lot of things in Delft. So I'm assistant professor at the Faculty of Technology, Policy and Management. So I teach, I have a lot of students, I have PhD students, I work in research projects, and I'm also very visible. So I make sure that I disseminate what we find to a larger audience, because I think it's important that what we do is shared among a larger public. So not only in academic journals, but also among people in the world outside the academic universities. Since last year, I'm also leading an energy transition lab, which is still a virtual lab, because we, at the moment that we started the lab, also Corona started. So we managed to start a lab with research and facilities and people completely online. But the fun thing is that we really managed to combine social scientists with engineers, with public administration, with people from all kinds of different levels in our lab to combine research. So we truly believe in interdisciplinary research, and the motto of the lab is that we create a safe environment for risky research. We do a bunch of other stuff in Delft. So we have a platform for social innovation. I also, for the Netherlands Enterprise Agency and for the International Energy Agency, I'm membering groups on behavioral insights in energy policy. And I'm also labeled as a climate psychologist, which was actually done by a Dutch newspaper. And now I happily copied that label to use it, because it says something about what I do. So my focus is on energy and energy transition, but actually the research that I do and also things I write about and like to think about are also more climate related. So they also have to do with climate change adaptation, not only with energy efficiency and energy transition, but also how people perceive climate change, etc. So that's about me. Now more about you. Of course, don't know who you are and what your backgrounds are. If you like to share it in the chat, it would be wonderful, not for me to read right now, but maybe to read it later, to see if you are from energy agencies, if you are from science, or if you are just interested in the topic. But I imagine that you all work with behavior change, or that you have some interest in energy policy. So imagine that you are dealing with the electricity field, and that your main aim is that you would like to have more insight in the behavior of people who have to charge their electric cars. That is, of course, a topic of the future. And there are also different ways to influence the car charging behavior of people. So you can facilitate it, you can make it technically possible. For instance, also use smart devices to have the charging, for instance, done at a moment during the night where there are no peaks. You can give people subsidies, or you can punish them. So there are all different ways to influence behavior. And one of the ways that we look at this from my academic field is that we use behavioral insights. And behavioral insights, as I said in my pitch, is not exactly the same as psychology, and it's also not even the same as behavioral change, because you can use behavioral insights for all kinds of different policy tools. So the tools that we have to steer behavior are pretty diverse. The carrots and the sticks. So you can reward people, for instance, with subsidies, but also in other ways. And you can punish people with taxes. And there are also different ways. So these are the classic ways to steer behavior. And of course, there's also the way to educate people. So to provide people with information, to enhance their knowledge about a certain topic, with the goal to change their attitudes and to change their behavior in the end. So this classic model of knowledge, attitudes, behavior is still being used a lot by policymakers dealing in the energy transition or dealing with other energy-related issues. However, this is not the complete picture of how it works in the brains of people. When you enhance knowledge, and even when the knowledge enhances the attitude, this will not, by definition, change the behavior. There is a gap between attitude and behavior. If you ask people, for instance, in a survey, are you willing to charge your car in the middle of the night, or maybe in the evening? Middle of the night would be a little bit too extreme, but late in the evening, then people would probably say, well, yeah, why not? If it's good for the environment and I can manage, why not? I will do that. They cannot give that answer in a survey. Well, when it's actually the moment that they have to do it, and it's raining, or they're watching this nice television program, or they're just relaxing and don't want to stand up from the couch, then this behavior is particularly difficult. So willing to change or willing to act green and actually performing the act is not the same. So there is this gap. And everybody knows, for instance, this: if you had a habit like smoking and you wanted to stop, the mind can give you some tricks to actually say this is not really bad too. Because if you have the knowledge about that smoking is bad for you, and you actually are willing to quit smoking, but you are not succeeding in quitting smoking, then you have this cognitive dissonance. So you have this tension in your brain that what you want is not the same as what you do. Then you automatically can reduce this cognitive dissonance by, for instance, making up excuse and changing your beliefs by saying, okay, well, my grandmother also smoked until she was 99 and died from natural causes, so that's not that bad. So there are some policy instruments to change behavior, and there are classic tools and there are newer tools. And the newer tools are, for instance, that we use behavioral insights to do this. And you see that there are more and more nudge units or behavioral nudges. I even read that there are companies who have a chief behavioral officer. It's being stated that taking into account behavioral insights and psychology is important. However, it is still very difficult. And I have this quote from a book I'm currently reading. Don't even think about it, why our brains are not wired to understand climate change. I think I'm not exactly sure about the subtitle. But psychology is very important for energy policy, but also very hard, because as this quote says, it's really difficult to grasp for us who we can blame or what we can do or where we need to do it. And as we do with dreams, we have these things in our minds. We want to associate all the thoughts that we have and make a story out of it, make a narrative. So people can make easily narratives of all the things that they find about climate change and about energy into a story that doesn't really is a rational story or a true story. So we create our own stories, and some of the stories lead to conspiracy theories, other stories lead to fear, other stories lead to action. But it is really difficult also for psychologists to understand this whole interaction of complex dynamics. And I really liked what she was saying about the difference between complexity and a complicated issue. So it's very complex. It's a wicked problem, climate change. So all the things that our minds can do, I already gave the example of how we deal with this tension in our heads if we don't do what we want to do. There are a bunch of biases, and there are a bunch of things that our minds do to make our life comfortable and also deal with all the triggers you get during the day. So a lot of these biases, there are many, many more of this. This is just a little picture of a large poster with all kinds of biases. But what we actually do is we have this irrational heuristics that we use to make sense of the world and also to get by. Because if we were taking in all the triggers that we get into our senses, we would not come through the day. So actually, this might be described as irrational behavior, but actually it's very functional. So rational behavior would be if you think about issues and you think about energy efficiency, you think about energy transition and how you should behave and how you charge your car and what you should do buying a heat pump or not. This is the rational way to process it. But in the end, we do it quicker and faster and dirtier, which is functional because it also helps us to make decisions. And research also shows that it often helps us to make good decisions, but they might not be very stable and not as policymakers or you as behavior changers think people would behave. People are more unpredictable in that sense. So if you look at the behavioral energy policy goals, we actually have a couple of goals that we describe. So we have these 3 goals. We want to reduce our carbon footprint. And we actually also, in our energy policies, looking at acceptance. So for instance, of new technologies and new policies. For instance, using different types of wind power or geothermal energy. I actually did my PhD thesis on carbon dioxide capture and storage technology and how people perceive that. And we are also looking at adaptation. So this is the categorization of energy policy goals. And I have a question for you that you might also want to answer in the chat if you like. The question is, what is the goal of energy policy stimulating dynamic EV charging? So people who are dealing with this EV charging, so electric vehicle charging, and they want to see if people are able to flexibly, for instance, charge their cars. What would you say would be the goal there? Would it be, in the end, to reduce the use of energy, so energy efficiency? Has this to do with acceptance, so acceptance of new ways of working, of new ways of charging cars, or maybe even acceptance of electric vehicles? Or would you think, okay, this is more of an adaptation question? I'm really curious to that. And I will open the chat if I see people answering. If not, give it a try, think about it. I actually go to the next slide here. That's not what I was meaning to do. If it's not something that you find easy to say, it's also more of an exercise to think for yourself what is exactly the goal of my policy. Because the reason also why I ask this is if you want to change behavior and you want to use behavioral insights, you also need to know exactly what the goal is. Because if you need to have a clear behavioral goal to decide upon what kind of tool you want to use. That's really connected to each other. And we sometimes see with policymakers that the tool is more of the end than the meaning. So they say, okay, I want to use nudging or I want to use framing. But then the question is, what is your specific behavioral goal? And then if we know that, you can see what the perfect tool would be.
Gerdien, I see a couple of reactions in the chat.
Okay.
Devon says somewhat adaptation, changing behavior to facilitate integration of renewables. And Torres also says adaptation.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, it's. I think that for every what you have picked would be a reason to pick it. I think the adaptation part is also important because it might not be adaptation to the effects of climate change, but adaptations to new technology and to work in a different way with different energy sources. So thank you for that. And thank you for pointing this out, Rebecca, because I didn't see it. Let me go to the next slide if it still works. I think I have to do this. An EU report in 2016, which is actually a very good report, not only focused on energy policy, but the energy policy is also a part of it. This report made the distinction between 3 types of behavioral insights in energy policy. So energy policies can be behaviorally aligned. So in hindsight, you could say, okay, this policy was effective or less effective because of this and this behavioral insight. You have behaviorally informed policies. These policies were actually created by people who thought about theories from psychology that they would apply to make this policy. And you have the behaviorally tested policies, which actually have a very rigorous setup, so that the policymakers actually thought, okay, we want to use this and this theory because we think that works. We do an assessment before we initiate the intervention. We measure behavior during the intervention. We measure behavior after the intervention. When it's really, really well done, there is actually maybe a randomized controlled trial with 2 groups, with one group getting an intervention A and the other group gets intervention B, and another group doesn't get an intervention at all, so the control group. And then you can really see if the intervention, based on behavioral insights, so this intervention could be an energy policy, but could also, for instance, be a product or some technology, that it actually was affecting the behavior. Effective in affecting behavior of people. So this is actually a very nice way to look at your energy policy. So maybe for yourself, if you already have done or created energy policies with behavioral insights, it's good to realize, okay, was I doing it beforehand? Can I explain maybe the effects by it, or did I actually took it the whole way and tested it? What you can also do is work together with researchers like me, so researchers that work for universities, but also researchers from research agencies, of course. And what psychologists can bring into this is that they can do the behavioral diagnostics. So psychologists have certain theories, certain perspectives and methods that are very useful for policymakers to apply in their creation of their tools, but also in the assessment of whether it works or not. And also, of course, by explaining the results in the end and writing it down, for instance, for dissemination. What we do more and more, where the field of psychology is heading towards is that it changes from an individual perspective, so a micro perspective field, to more of an application and integration with the system perspective. So more and more psychologists, especially in the field of energy and climate, try to integrate what we can, so our theories, perspectives and methods, with what's out there on system thinking, or for instance, the people who make scenarios or models for the long run. So that's really an exciting area we go into, that the fundamental psychological mechanisms and things that we'd like to explain in our laboratories on a very small field are applied to a larger context. Furthermore, as I said, also our methods and also the ways that we do analysis can also help to test and create these behavioral interventions. So this perspective I explained to you, connecting the micro perspective to the group perspective and more into the system perspective. And this is where the field is heading towards, and which is what I said, very exciting. And this is, I'm taking a look at the time. So yeah, I have a little bit more time. This is an example of how a research line could look like if you really take into account this, you do this behaviorally tested energy policy making. that you observe behavior in the system, and that you combine this with the theories that are already there and see, okay, why can we explain from literature why people don't charge their cars during the night? And then you are going to assess that. So you ask people with electric cars, for instance, why, when do you charge your car? Would you be willing to do that during the night? Observing maybe their behavior, because if what I said before, you can ask them if they are willing to do it, but that's something different than that they actually do it. Then you can design interventions to help people to act in the way that your policy has envisioned. You test your intervention in the lab, so in a controlled setting, you test it in the field, you monitor it, and then if you have these findings and say, okay, we now know this and this about electric charging and whether it would work and whether we should have a technical solution for it, or maybe we should use a stick or use a carrot or use something else. In the end, that is, of course, also the goal to share that with a larger audience. At least that is what we as scientists do, of course, but we make it public. And I'm an advocate of open science and to share the findings with a larger group, especially, of course, when it comes to climate change and energy transition, because we're heading towards a crisis there, as well as we had with the corona crisis. So we cannot wait too long with sharing information. So I already told about these behavioral interventions, and also said we already use behavioral insights in all kinds of interventions, in subsidies, in technological devices, etc. But there are also some really behavioral interventions. So you might know that there's something like framing, and framing is actually how you put something in a frame, literally. So if I take a frame of, for instance, my room, where I am in now. If I take a frame from my background, you would see a nice yellow wall and some papers. But if I move this frame towards that side, you would see that my laundry is hanging there. You don't see it now, luckily. But this is a completely other view than that view. And this is also what changes in the public eye. So the framing, this picture is about nuclear power and how it's being portrayed, for instance, in media and in a debate, but also by policymakers, can change. And in what perspective or frame a certain policy or issue is placed has a large influence on the perception of people about that policy, and even also if they're willing to act upon it. So this also relates, for instance, to the issue of greenwashing that you sometimes read about. So that if companies are perceived as portraying their industry or what they are doing as very sustainable, but people have the perception that in the end the company is not that sustainable, but still is doing, for instance, business in an unsustainable way, then this could be seen as manipulative, and so this could be seen as a bad way of framing and as greenwashing. But framing is not lying, it's just another perspective. But you must be very aware that the perspective that you choose, the lens that you choose for your policy or your issue is very important. And indeed, it can lead to maybe more acceptance, but also to more resistance if people don't believe it or think that you are framing in a manipulative way. So framing is an interesting line of thinking when you're talking about tools that use psychology. Nudging is another one. So you might have heard about the term nudge in before. A nudge is a little push into a certain direction. And nudges make use of behavioral insights. And for instance, one of the topics that I do much research in is in the concept of the hassle factor. Hassle, people perceive a lot of hassle with a lot of things that they do in their lives. And they like to be have an effortless, easy life above all. So you could say charging your electric car in the night is a hassle because you have to get up and you have to go out, stand up from the couch, go outside through the rain, And charge your car, for instance. If you can help people to take away the hassle, for instance, by making the charging automatically, because you have some kind of device that lets the car start charging in itself during the night, then that would be easy. So smart meters, smart devices. So this is a dishwasher in the upper corner that has a default setting on the eco button. So I actually have a dishwasher myself like that. So the default is eco. It's a longer but a more sustainable program. And if you don't change it, so you just put start, it does the eco thing. So that is better for the environment and easier for me. So in this case, I would do something more hassle-full myself to change that default. A timer in the shower, for instance, on the other corner that helps you to see, okay, I want to take a shower for 3 minutes and not for 10 minutes. This actually helps you to make visible, okay, time is running up. Let's stop showering. In the other left corner, in the upper left corner, you see a nudge that is used often, and that is giving people insight in, for instance, what their neighbors do when it comes to electricity use. So it actually helps that people see where they are. So the social norm, where are other people and how much energy do they use, is important for people to measure their own behavior up to. And in this case, it could really help. So if you have a high use of energy and you see that your neighbors use less, it could help to lower down your own energy use. But it also works the other way around. If you see that other people surrounding you use far more energy than you do, you can also think about, okay, well, why do I take these short showers and use the eco program of my dishwasher all the time? Let's do a little less green and act like the rest. So this social norm works both ways. So these are some examples of intervention that are often used in energy policies to change behavior. So besides the technological interventions or the monetary interventions. So as a final note, I would share with you that it is important when you are changing behavior that you take responsibility. It comes with responsibility if you use behavioral insights for energy policies. As I said before, your interventions can be perceived as manipulation. I did research on framing and if framing could be seen as manipulative, and especially if people perceive you as an organization or company as an objective, trustworthy, credible organization, and they think that you positively frame all your green actions, and then that could backfire. So it's important to realize that what you're doing comes with responsibility. The role of the intervener, so the one that uses the behavioral intervention or creates the intervention used with behavioral insights, is also important. So people have a certain perception of organizations, of other people. So it depends, so that the frame that you take has an interactive effect with the role that you have. So exactly the same frame, and we also showed that with research, can be perceived differently if you are Shell, if you are Greenpeace, or if you are the Dutch national government, for instance. So this is also important to realize. And something else is that it's being said, for instance, for nudging, it's important that they are transparent to be ethically okay. That there must be an opt-out, and that they are for the well-being of the people that are receiving it. But these are, of course, very difficult things. So if you are too transparent, will it still work? Well, there's research that shows that it still works, even if organizations are transparent about the fact that they use behavioral insights in their policies. An opt-out, especially for governmental organizations, that this is a very important one. And I would say to be responsible, you always should have an opt-out. So you cannot manipulate people into a tunnel and say, okay, this is how we steer you and this is the only behavior that you take. So even if you, for instance, in the health domain, nudges are used often, you can put the fruit closer to the people, for instance, when they have to buy food in the canteen of their the work organization. So you manipulate them maybe to buy fruit because it's closer to them than the not healthy options. But then there's still, maybe you can consider to have an opt-out, that people don't need to buy fruit, that they can also buy something else if they don't like fruit or are allergic to it. And yeah, finally, what is well-being? Who decides what is well-being? That is, of course, one of the larger tasks for governments, that they have to think about that. But it's sometimes open for debate. What is well-being? If, for instance, one of the larger policies that uses also this an opt-out and opt-in system is organ donation. So actually in the Netherlands, we changed it from an opt-in to an opt-out system. So everybody now who doesn't actively say that they don't want to be a donor organ after they die are registered in the system as that they are willing to do it. So you actively have to opt out of this. Of course, there are still in the end, family can decide. It's not that black and white, but there was a huge debate upon that. So is what is well-being, that we have more donors, or that people have the right to decide over their own lives? And with climate issues, you could think about this in the same way. How can you steer people into green behavior? Who is to decide what is good behavior when it comes to sustainable matters? So this is the responsibility and ethical part, which is important to mention, of course. We are heading towards the end after maybe not only this session, but also the introduction, and maybe after the whole Behave conference and other things that you are reading or listening or hearing from other people, would you consider applying behavioral insights in your future energy policies? Think about this. It's not that if we had a poll, but it's not possible to do a poll here, I would definitely make a poll and have a quick yes or no round. But think about this for yourself, and maybe you'd like to share it in the chat or not. I think I would like to end with I have to do this like this, I guess, with showing you this report that was recently published by the USSTCP and the International Energy Agency group that I am membership. It's a whole report about behavioral insights for demand-side energy policy and programs. A lot of interesting things are in it. There's also an investigation of cases over the world, but also some explanation about the things that I also discussed about the behaviorally aligned, informed, and tested policies. And then I would like to end with the last slide. If you have any questions or would like to know more about the things that we do, you can reach out to me through all kinds of ways on Twitter, LinkedIn. I vlog on YouTube, but it's in Dutch, so not maybe for everybody really useful. You can send me an email or visit one of the websites from our lab or the platform on social innovation. And I would like to end my presentation with this, but there's of course room for questions. And okay, if there are any questions, please unmute yourself and put your camera on and ask me the question, because I'm curious. And maybe you can also say who you are, then I know a little bit of the background where you're coming from.
Yeah, I'm hoping everybody is able to do that. It might be
okay.
But thank you very much, Gerdien, for a very inspiring presentation. I think we have about 10 minutes for questions then. I couldn't see any in the chat.
I see that someone, Elena, is raising a hand.
Ah, Elena.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
Thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. Let me just find a better angle. My question is about individual and collective level when you approach like behavioral science, because mostly if you work with energy modeling, you have a habit to model like cities, buildings, big scales. Rather than when you work with behavioral approaches, you work on the very individual level. And numerically, it's not always like big numbers when you see like how one person consumes something. It's getting very neglectable number. So how you kind of bridge this idea of individual scale behavioral approaches and scaling them to the like city level, for example, grid operation planning? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think this is one of the largest challenges that we have. I always say we have to come up with ways that keep the psychologists and the modelers happy, because the modelers are used to take very big steps when it comes to psychology and behavior, and they make large assumptions. But psychologists, on the other end, are making it too micro and say, okay, this is not exactly how people work. So we need to give in somewhere. And what we, for instance, do is that one of my students did that the other day for a model, is that she looked at a lot of data. So there are a lot of data on human behavior, for instance, energy behavior. Assume this is not exactly the case, but assume it's about heating. So it's about temperature in the house. And people would like to, for instance, model how warm individual homeowners want to have it in their rooms, in their houses, and their behavior when it comes to turning the thermostat. I'm not sure if it's an English word, but yeah, is it an okay? I see. Yeah. So what we actually do then is collecting data on what we know. And what we don't know, we collect extra data with larger groups, so hundreds of people, and then we aggregate that to a larger level and make, for instance, groups to quantify it for the model. So there is where the psychologists need to give in something, because we cannot say okay, all people fall into a certain category, but we need for the model to make, for instance, 4 categories: the people who like to have a warm house but are flexible, people who are not flexible and like their houses warm, people who like a lower temperature, and people who like a lower temperature but also are flexible. And these groups, for instance, we can use for a model. And that makes the model richer than it was before, where they didn't take into account this kind of human behavior, like comfort or the behavior of turning actually the thermostat. So it makes the model richer, not perfect, but also it helps us in our psychological models to aggregate it to a higher level. So would that be an answer to your question, Elena?
Yeah, it's actually pointing on what I'm trying to do. So thank you so much. Good to know that I'm in the right direction. Thank you.
Yeah, so if you ever need it, because in our energy transition lab, we work with modelers and behavioral scientists. So if you have any questions or would like to talk about this further, please reach out.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Thank you. And are there any other questions? If not, I have a question from our side. So, Gerdien, in your opinion, what's the most effective way that researchers from academia and energy practitioners from energy agencies could collaborate together in the future? Have you got any suggestions of how you think we could collaborate more?
Yeah, so what we do often already is work together in research projects. Mostly we start with master thesis projects for 21 weeks. And then if the organization has a specific question, we ask the student to think about that specific question and turn it into also a scientific research question, because we are, of course, not a consultancy organization as a university. So we would like to, what we find, share to a larger academic public. So it also needs to be scientifically new. But a lot of our students in Delft are doing their master thesis outside, so with companies, with organizations, and sometimes they even stay there, of course, after they're graduated, if the cooperation went well. But that would be a very first good step, because if you cooperate or collaborate, as C said it, you actually also talk to each other and try to identify what questions there really are and what pain points there really are, so that you can tackle them. So only having a coffee or doing a presentation is sending one way. It's one-way communication is not really, I think, the best way to do this.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
And perhaps we have time for one more question. If there aren't any from the audience, I have one myself. Is it more difficult to change values and attitudes towards energy than it is to change behavior?
Yeah, I think that relates to what I said before. So, in a sense, changing behavior can be easy, for instance, with nudges and automatic reflexes. So if you change something in the choice architecture, you can also change the behavior of people, but that is automatic behavior where people actually didn't think about. So if you want to have a stable internal motivation of people to change their behavior into a certain direction, you need to deal with the values and attitudes, which are difficult, of course, to change, because people have these values, have that internated, and then, of course, it's difficult if you have these attitudes. Then people find it sometimes also hard to pronounce their attitudes and to know from themselves if what they think, what I said about the tension between what you think and what you do, that there is this big gap, so that even you can have a positive. So I have a positive attitude towards electric bikes, for instance, but I haven't bought one yet. There are all kinds of things that barrier me. Yeah, so difficult to answer.
Yes, indeed. I see the time. We're supposed to go back to the the other room. Okay. And I presume if we click on the Breakout Rooms button, we should be able to return.
Oh yeah, we get a chat message.
The session
will be moved back to main. Okay.
So we don't need to do anything?
I think we move ourselves. I see people disappearing.
So we click on Breakout Rooms again.
Choose Breakout Rooms.
Wait, choose Breakout Room. I think
we can do that. 4C, main session.
4C. So if you go back to 4C, everybody. And thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Didier Bosseboeuf from ADEME, the French Agency for Ecological Transition. I work on the direction of research and forecasting, and I am in charge from more than 40 years of energy efficiency, policy evaluation, and climate policies. And when you combine energy efficiency policy and climate, at one point of time, you will shift to sufficiency. And this is the topic of our session today, which has been introduced by Edouard. And the reason why I was co-chairing this session with Edouard is that in my day-to-day job, I am embarked in some works on sufficiency through the monitoring of the chairmanship of the working group ENR on monitoring tool, which rely on the Odyssey Mur project, where we introduce this time some indicator on sufficiency and some description of sufficiency policies and measures. I am also running a sharing working group on the French Observatory of Fuel Poverty, which is more or less linked with this issue of sufficiency. And I have, let's say, organized the first workshop on sufficiency at institutional level 1 or 2 years ago. So there are good reason why I'm very happy to share this session. And we will start by, as you have seen, there are two complementary presentations, one from an agency, an institution, and one from academic, from Johan. And we will start by the presentation of Eric Vidalin from the French agency. But before that, we have made a small survey. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see it?
Not yet. Yes, now we can.
Okay, so we implement a small survey within the IENA agency to see at which extent they are embarked on sufficiency, and particularly how the behavioral sciences or social sciences will be used for tackling this issue. And this was based on 4 questions, very simple. First, do you have some staff dedicated to social science? And among the sampling, half of the agency claim to have dedicated staff for behavioral insight. For instance, at ADEME, we have at least 2 full-time sociologists in our direction. And the area are large. They are from social aspect of energy efficiency or sufficiency policy, on fuel poverty, on raise of awareness, on communication campaign, education information, and also on forecasting. And Eric will demonstrate that type of activities in case of ADEME. Second question, is your agency or organization working on sufficiency? So more or less the same ratio, half of the agency are working on sufficiency. And in addition, 4 other agencies in the sampling are indirectly work on sufficiency project, like, for example, working on circular economy. So what we can say from that second question is agencies start to embark on sufficiency, energy resource and consumption sufficiency, depend on the agency. But the main topic, main focus, it's clearly energy sufficiency, because basically we are firstly energy agency dealing with energy efficiency renewables. And but some of them, 3, have broader perspective, working on circular economy, resource sufficiency, or strategic raw material, like in the Dutch agency, and even consumption sufficiency, as we do, for instance, at ADEME. So what we can say is when we work on energy sufficiency, which is our main, let's say, interest, you cannot avoid to parallelly work on resource and consumption sufficiency. I think this is an important lesson from this questionnaire. And the last point was, in which sector are you working? Are you working only at research level with academic, or also are you implementing policies? And there is, this concept is quite new, and clearly there are very, very few agencies which are embarked on at implementation level. The most clear situation is on circular economy and on, let's say, one aspect of sufficiency which can be directly touched upon, is fuel poverty and awareness campaign. In conclusion, this concept is rather new in the agency, as it was mentioned by Edouard, but clearly there is a continuum of our job on classic job on energy efficiency, and since it's clear that if we combine energy efficiency and climate change, we have to embark on sufficiency, because energy efficiency will be not sufficient to reach our target. So based on that questionnaire, we will move to a first aspect of this session, which is to show how an agency is dealing with sufficiency on its day-to-day activities. And this presentation will be delivered by my colleague and I can say friend, Vidalinck, which is working in a regional branch of ADEME in the north of France, and he's coordinated the ecological regional pole. He's also coordinating the ADEME long-term vision of in 2050 scenario, and one of the scenario is sufficiency. And this vision, it's a combined energy, resource, and consumption sufficiency. It's also expert on research for the European Commission, working on some program of H2020 in the Research Fund for Coal and Steel. And what is also interesting, he worked with on communication purpose, I may say, through his action with the journal Futurib, which is a review journal on long-term forecasting. And he's lecturer in 5 universities, and he has personally developed a blog on sufficiency. So he is the right man to work and to deliver this speech on what we are doing at ADEME as an illustration of an activity of energy agencies on sufficiency. So the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. I'm pleased to be here this morning and to give you an overview about what we do at ADEME about sufficiency for many years now on several aspects: energy efficiency, resource efficiency, and consumption sufficiency. So we prepare with many colleagues some slides to give you this overview with 6 categories of action. First, institutional aspect about what we are doing on sufficiency. Then research activity, particularly the demonstration project or research project funded by ADEME. Then the foresight activity and the scenarios that we are currently building. Then circular economy, monitoring sufficiency with barometer, and at last communication action. So first the institutional aspect about our work on sufficiency. We try to give a shared definition about what sufficiency means for us at ADEME. For the first time in 2015, sufficiency appeared in the law in France. So it's a major date because we are in the time where we go from NGOs area to institutional area, and 2015 is an important law and a date for that. What do we write in our definition? So for us, it's important to say that sufficiency is a multidimensional concept. It's not only an individual or personal issue, but it's in the same time a collective and a political issue. So we have to work on policies, infrastructures, technologies, and of course consumption when we deal about sufficiency. And we wrote this definition by considering the work done by NGO Negawatt, the network Enough, or the donut theory, for example. You will find all the references at the end of the presentation to find this paper and more details about what we say this morning. Other action on institutional initiative. Didier said some word about the first workshop about energy sufficiency 2 years ago. I won't say more, maybe some more about the National Observatory on Fuel Poverty. It was created 10 years ago, and why for us it is important? Because it's a multi-partner initiative.
Could you change your slide, please?
Yeah, for me it is. It's on the ONPE. It's not the case for you?
Not for me. I don't know for the others.
It's still on the institutional slide for us.
It's not moved.
I'm really sorry because...
That's fine. No.
Okay. Sorry, it was the case for me, but don't hesitate to tell me. So ONPE, it's a National Observatory on Fuel Poverty. What is important to say about it? It's a multi-partner initiative. We are 29 partners from local authorities, state, national agencies, NGOs, and utilities. And for us, why it is important, with this kind of tools of observatory, it's a mean to see concretely how people who have to deal with forced sufficiency, how people choose between some action or in their daily life, in their lifestyle, how they deal with all these constraints. So it's not only sufficiency is not only an issue for us to say what sufficiency has to be, but how sufficiency is in some case implemented by people, and in this case by people with limited income. In a second point, we give you some example of what we do at ADEME about research. So now some word about the research activities on sufficiency. Each year at ADEME, we funded approximately 30 or 40 theses. And when we look at the past theses, we can say that in the recent year, approximately 1/4 of theses are related to the concept of sufficiency. So I won't repeat again. You have some example of the theses that we funded the last year, in the recent year, and you see that it's quite amazing, in fact, even for us, when we see that approximately 1/4 of theses are related to the concept of sufficiency. Next slide, Irina, please. About the research, again, we started an observatory on current trends and weak signal. Since 2019, we detected 12 weak signal on sufficiency in the research area, and it's for us to know not only what we do, but what the other research institute or agency can do and can publish on sufficiency issues. Next slide, Irina, please. Now the third point, some word about the long-term foresight and long-term scenarios that we are currently building. We decided to build 4 scenarios for the carbon neutrality in France in 2050. I'm only give you some words this morning, tell you some words this morning about the first one. We decided to adopt the archetypes of scenario from the special report of IPCC, special report for 2018. It's interesting because in this archetypes of scenario, we see very different levels: sufficiency, efficiency, decarbonization, and carbon sinks. Why it's interesting? Because it's the first time that we see in IPCC publication so strong focus on sufficiency issue. So we adopt these archetypes. And next slide, please, Irina. In the case of France, for example, you can see the kind of assumption that we consider in this global vision. For buildings, you can see, for example, we reduce strongly the new buildings construction. We divide by 3 approximately, with a growing population. So the issue is really to better use the existing houses and buildings. In the transport system, we reduce the mobility in a strong, approximately 25% of the mobility for each. And you can see other hypotheses about the diet of people with the reduction of meat. Even if it's a current trend, in fact, we consume less and less meat. We accelerate the reduction of meat consumption, and we accelerate to the reduction of food weight, for example, in this kind of sufficiency scenario. Next slide, thanks, Irina. It's not at all a final result, but it's a way to show you with these 4 scenarios what are the preliminary results that we can see today. Today, the first scenario, where the sobriety sufficiency is the main lever, it's the only scenario where we are able to divide by 2 the final energy consumption in 2050. It's an objective set in the law of 2015 that I quoted before. And it's interesting to see that for now, it's the only scenario that can reach this target, even if it's not the main target of our scenario. The main target is the carbon neutrality, but you can see the power of the sufficiency with efficiency and renewable development, of course, in this scenario. You can see the power and the impact of sufficiency in a global vision and in a long-term vision.
Okay,
Next.
sorry, Eric, but you have only 1 more minute to
give
the floor of the other speaker.
Thanks, Didier. I will do quickly the 3 last points. Sufficiency is not only considered from an energy point of view, but we work about the resource sufficiency too, about program on circular economy, about foresight on circular economy or roadmap, for example. Next slide, Irina, please. To show you an overview about the support about the circular economy program in the recovery plan, you see that it's approximately 500 million per year for the next two years. Next slide. We try to monitoring the sufficiency issue too. You see that we have for many years several barometer, and in 2021 we will create a barometer on sufficiency. Even if we consider in some other barometer this issue, we will develop a special barometer on this topic. Next, Irina, please. Just an example about the question considering sufficiency in the existing barometer. You see that we have a lot of question about sufficiency issue. Next one.
I'm really sorry, Eric, but we have to stop at one point.
Okay, so you won't get the last two diapo, but it will be sent to next to slide. It will be sent to you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. We see an holistic view of what an agency is dealing on sufficiency. Now I give the floor to Edouard, which will manage the next presentation.
Thank you, Didier. Well, it's quite encouraging to see that Eric had so many things to say that he couldn't even finish his presentation. So it shows that sufficiency is more and more considered. What is interesting in what he said is that in the sophisticated energy scenarios that ADEME has developed, only the one with strong sufficiency assumptions meet the French national target of halving the final energy consumption by 2050. So a clear question is now, how do we get there? What kind of policies and measures are needed to reach these strong sufficiency assumptions? And that's what we will hear now from Joanne Wade. She has done so many things in her life that it's difficult to summarize it, but let me say that she has a very long experience in working on energy efficiency and has always combined academic research with more advisory activities in the public sector. And Joanne has recently coordinated a project on energy sufficiency policies at European level within ECEEE, the European Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. So please, Joanne, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Edouard. Okay, fantastic. Well, good morning, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. So what I want to talk about this morning is how the infrastructures that we are surrounded by in everyday life, how they are needed to support the change we need towards energy sufficiency. To achieve sufficiency, we need to change the way we live our lives. And as individuals, we will have to change our demands for energy services. Either we will have to reduce our demands, or we will somehow have to change the quality of those demands. There's a lot that we can do individually to change our behaviour. I can decide to leave my lights on for less time or have fewer rooms in the house lit. I can do that. I can do that myself. But those sort of individual actions are going to be nowhere near enough to get us to where we need to be. Many of the sorts of changes that are needed, so things like choosing to travel more actively, walking and cycling, choosing to live in smaller spaces or in more shared spaces, choosing to eat food that has a lower planetary footprint. All these things require infrastructures that we can only create communally. Now, those infrastructures are in part physical. So let's think about that first. There are the obvious elements that we as an energy-related community always talk about, an energy system that meets our energy needs in the least impactful way. But sufficiency is actually much more about non-energy infrastructures. We in the energy efficiency community talk about quite a lot of those a lot of the time. So healthy, low impact housing, for example, or more cycle lanes to support active travel. As an energy efficiency community, we talk about those. What we often don't talk about and think about is the even broader infrastructures that we need for sufficiency. So it's about designing cities, whole cities, that are appropriate for their local climate, so that people can move around on foot and by bicycle comfortably and safely throughout the year. So the middle picture here on this slide is of a pavement in Bologna. Those arches provide shade and cool in the summer and shelter from the snow in the winter. Bologna is designed and was designed hundreds of years ago to fit within its local environment, enable its citizens to move around actively. It's also about making sure that shared outdoor spaces are the places that people want to be. The picture on the right of this slide is London's South Bank by the River Thames. It's a really popular area for people to relax and socialise. Shared outdoor space that people use for recreation enables not only smaller individual living space, but also it encourages city dwellers to stay in the city at the weekend, say, rather than driving into the countryside for recreation. So the way that we design whole cities has a fundamental impact on the extent to which we as individuals can choose to be more sufficient. Achieving sufficiency, though, is not just about physical infrastructure. We need a societal consensus about what we actually mean by sufficiency. As Eric has already mentioned, we have a donut-style representation of sufficiency. It was developed by Tina Fawcett and Sarah Darby from the University of Oxford, based on Kate Rayworth's work. I was very pleased to see Eric using it. It's nice to know it's out there and being useful. In this diagram, sufficiency is illustrated by the green donut ring. If we're living outside the outer edge of the ring, we're exceeding one or more of the planet's ecological boundaries. If we're living inside the innermost circle, we don't have access to some of the energy services we require to support our needs. Now, we know a lot about the outer planetary limits, and I would say the consensus on their precise definition is increasing. We also have an increased understanding and a decent understanding of what our fundamental needs are as human beings. But I don't think we yet agree on whether a sufficient level of energy services is one that supports us to meet those fundamental needs alone, or whether it's about more than that, supporting us to do more than simply meeting those needs. What do we mean by enough? What is sufficient? And we certainly don't agree on whether everybody should have equal access to energy services within that overall green space of sufficiency. We can take a lot of sufficiency actions without this agreement, but for us to completely achieve a state of energy sufficiency, we are going to need to reach a collective consensus on what we want. I also think discussing that issue will help us to start those initial actions that we can take. Now, both designing those physical infrastructures to support sufficiency and reaching consensus on where we actually want to be are both processes that are going to benefit from two things, and that is decentralization and democratization of the way we govern our energy system and more broadly. Decentralization, because the people best placed to design a thriving, livable city are the people who know it best. They're the people who live and work there. Democratization, because if we're attempting to change the way people live, we're going to be far more successful if the new ways of doing things are collaboratively designed by the people who are going to be doing them. Energy sufficiency has a lot of co-benefits. It's not just about carbon emissions reduction. On the right-hand side of this slide here, you can see a collection of some of the words and phrases, the positive things that people associate with the idea of sufficiency. And a lot of those come from its co-benefits. It's things like health and happiness, sharing, equity, solidarity, well-being. In summary, it's about living well within our limits. And it's based, in part at least, on a fundamental concept of fairness. And I think all those sort of concepts and co-benefits form the basis for a very positive and constructive citizen-led process of change. And there is a very central role here for local government and for other public sector agencies to help drive these processes. There's quite a lot of work going on at the moment to develop tools that will help organisations like local government to drive this change. These pictures are just three of the range of tools that are available. Now, in Europe, and certainly in the work that I've been doing, we've tended to start looking at sufficiency action very much from the perspective of reducing excessive consumption. And indeed, you heard Eric say just a few minutes ago to talk about the ways that ADEME was defining reducing excess and things like this. At a macro level in Europe, we very much are outside the outer edge of the donut, so that's a very appropriate place to start. But Eric was also talking about the Fuel Poverty Observatory, and it's very clear that the concept of sufficiency is equally powerful in helping to focus attention on energy justice and on how to improve things for people in our societies who don't have enough, because there are far too many of them. All these tools that are being developed really do reflect that dual purpose. And I think there are two things that are perhaps food for thought here. Sufficiency treats the achievement of enough energy services for everyone and the protection of the planet as two goals that coexist alongside one another and should be met together. And I think that's quite a contrast with the political narrative in many countries that often almost sets action on climate change and action on energy poverty as things that are somehow opposed to one another and need to be balanced against one another rather than done together. So I think maybe using the framework of sufficiency is a way to be more constructive about how to meet those two challenges together. The other thing that I would point out is that I think all of the tools that I've seen tend to be growth agnostic. They don't take economic growth as an end in itself. It may be needed in some cases to achieve goals, but it's not something that we should be just aiming for in and of itself, which I think is very different from where most political ideas are in Europe today. And thinking about the economy and what sufficiency says about it, I think it's interesting to consider the usefulness of sufficiency when we think about the twin challenges we have at the moment, bringing together decarbonising the economy and recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Fairness and improved well-being are both ideas at the heart of all the work on sufficiency, and they are ideas that are common to the political discourse on the transition to net zero and on how to stimulate recovery from the pandemic. And I'd just like to read these two quotes to you. The first one is from Scotland's Just Transition Commission, and that is an advisory commission that was set up to advise the Scottish Government on a net zero economy that is fair for all. And the Commission says, we are committed to growing an inclusive net zero economy, a more cohesive and resilient economy that improves opportunities, life chances, and well-being of every citizen in our country. The second quote is from the introduction to a recent UK government publication on economic recovery from the pandemic. It says, we will level up our country so the map of our whole United Kingdom is lit up with competitive cities and vibrant towns that are centres of life. Places people are proud to call home, with access to the services and jobs they need to thrive. Now, Scotland's Just Transition Commission and the UK Prime Minister are perhaps both working within the current dominant economic paradigm, and perhaps neither of them are particularly growth agnostic. But other than that, they are pretty far apart, politically speaking. They don't have very much in common. And yet, when you read these two quotes, they're both talking about well-being, about thriving cities. They are talking about the end results that the concept of sufficiency can help us deliver if we can put in place the infrastructures and the governance processes that will make it possible for us to get there. There's lots of individual policy examples of sufficiency, things that are being done that I could talk about, but I thought it was probably worth just in this formal session introducing some of the concepts. I'm happy to talk about the policies as we have a discussion afterwards. I think what I just wanted to put out there in my talk was that where we're at with sufficiency now is a challenge for all of us who work in this area to ensure that policy changes so that the infrastructures, both physical and societal, are put in place that will enable us to change the way we do things. That's all I want to say in terms of an overall presentation so that we have time for discussion. Thank you very much for listening. And if you're interested in the work we've been doing on sufficiency, the website address is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan, for your important input, because there are a lot of reflection on the individual action on sufficiency, and I think you really demonstrate that it's not only individual issue but a collective issue, and this is a very important input. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time for a question. Maybe some question will emerge on the third part of this session, which is the let's say plenary session, where we make a summary of all the 3 session, breakout session. So I encourage all the participants to shift to the main room right now. I don't know how to do it, but you can try to do it. So thank you for the 2 speakers and all the participants, and see you in 1 minute in the plenary session. Thank you.
Let's start. So a very warm welcome to breakout session 3 on engaging with vulnerable target groups. Thank you for selecting our breakout session. So just to give you an overview of what we'll do in this breakout. So I will start with an overview of some survey results that we did on definitions of vulnerable consumers with our European Energy Network members. Then we'll have a talk from C. Rotmann, which we're very pleased to have with us today, on vulnerable energy users and definitions. And then we'll have time for questions and answers, and then we'll return for the last 10 minutes of the session to the main room, where we will go through the closing remarks. So these are some results from the survey that we did with European Energy Network members. So we asked them to answer a short survey and tell us whether they had a definition for vulnerable energy consumers and hard to reach energy consumers in their country, and whether they have support programs and measures in place to help these target groups. And we did this just to give us an idea of each country's approach to the definitions and to support programs, because there isn't although there are some EU level policies, there aren't any common definitions across Europe or EU member states on defining vulnerable consumers. So our first question was to ask whether there was a definition in their country, and just over half said that there is for vulnerable consumers, and then the rest either said that they didn't have an official definition in their country or that one was in development. None of the respondents had or knew of a definition of hard to reach energy consumers in their country. And what we did notice, though, that for vulnerable consumers, in some cases, respondents said that their country doesn't have a definition for vulnerable consumers, but in fact, their countries do have one, according to reports from the European Commission. So this could hint at maybe there's some confusion about the various terminologies used, or it could be that maybe these terms aren't very well known across people in the sector. So what are the definitions used across European countries? So typically the definition of vulnerable consumers is a broader term that does include people who are at risk of energy poverty, but it's broader because it includes people who are in some way at a disadvantage in the energy market. And we saw that countries did have quite a few different approaches to how they defined vulnerable energy consumers, and some countries would link it to social welfare payments. Other countries link it to affordability of energy, so looking at low income, high expenditure. Others related to health issues, and others to socioeconomic characteristics. And why does it matter? Why do definitions matter? Well, estimating the number of vulnerable energy consumers depends on the definitions that we use, and then this has an effect on the support programs that are planned and who gets the help. And it also raises the question that if we only look at the problem from one of these angles, so if we only look at it from the health issues angle or the affordability angle, it could be that other people that fall outside of this definition are being missed. And finally, in our quick survey, we asked respondents to tell us whether their country had measures and programs to support vulnerable consumers. And in most countries there was quite a few different types of support measures listed. And they tended to be offering vulnerable consumers energy saving advice or energy saving improvements, so either home improvements or upgrading appliances. Some countries used additional legal protections, so for example making it preventing energy suppliers from cutting off energy to certain people, and financial support as well in the form of reduced energy tariffs and grants. So there are lots of programs being delivered to support vulnerable consumers across Europe. But going back to the previous point, if the definitions are narrow, it could mean that then these programs are only helping some people and not others, or they might only be helping people with one aspect of the problem rather than a holistic support. So that is all from our quick survey, just to give us a bit of context of how this is approached in Europe. And now I will hand over to C. Rotmann.
Cara, I will very quickly do the screen sharing thing again and just check that this works. You can see the main screen, the main PowerPoint?
Yes, yeah, we can see.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks again for inviting me to talk about vulnerable energy users. So I'm doing this as part of our research collaboration under the users TCP by IEA, which is functionally and legally autonomous of the IEA Secretariat in Paris. I just want to note that. And after researching behavior change with 14 countries around the world for 8 years, we realized that there was a really large user group that was actually not being engaged or motivated in the various energy efficiency and behavior change programs around the world. And they're generally regarded as hard to reach energy users. We hypothesized when we started this project that it was about a third of energy users. And as you'll hear, we vastly underestimated that number. So the worst problem is that it's not their fault that they're being called hard to reach. The terminology on its own is problematic. It seems to put the onus on them, not on us behavior changers who are actually trying to reach them with our behavioral interventions. And so our shared goal in this task, as I said, we did the work of bringing the multiple stakeholders around the table and spent quite a bit of time on figuring out our shared goals and our individual goals as well, was to help identify and characterize these energy users and to figure out how we can help behavior changes to best engage them whilst serving equity and energy justice needs. And that is really where I'm really happy that in this Venn diagram of the different countries that are participating, we all agreed that equity was a consideration that was hugely important. So what you can see here is our definition of hard to reach energy users for this task. As I said, I now always make sure that we're very clear on definitions and we co-create them, and it takes quite a bit of wordsmithing. And so in this task, a hard-to-reach energy user is an energy user from the residential or commercial sectors who uses any type of energy or fuel, who is typically either hard to reach physically, underserved, or hard to engage or motivate by behavior change, energy efficiency, and demand response interventions that are intended to serve our mutual needs. And on our website, we have a whole bunch of asterisks that explain what these individual terms mean as well. Now, as you'll see, this definition is extremely broad on purpose. We wanted to include and capture all hard-to-reach energy users, including those that are usually ignored, such as high-income earners and high consumers, or building operators in commercial office buildings or commercial buildings in general. And we've done a lot of in-depth work to define the many different types of hard-to-reach energy users more clearly based on their demographics, their psychographics, their barriers and needs, and we did some audience size estimates as well. And that's what happened. We created the beast, as we called it. It's our literature review. I talked about it yesterday in session 1B, so I'm not going to repeat too much of that. We're hopefully finally going to publish it next month. We're just updating a whole lot of the COVID country statistics, which obviously go outdated really quickly. I'm not going to talk too much about that either, except that we based this literature review on a landscape analysis with our stakeholders, which is in this hard-to-reach characterization that I've linked to on the bottom there, to figure out what the priority hard-to-reach audiences are for the different countries that are working with us. And so we did a lot of in-depth stakeholder interviews, collected survey data, reached out to networks, and then did like a really in-depth literature search of over 1,000 publications. And the scope is here. It's got 9 chapters. It's got over 255 pages. The chapters in purple here are the audience chapters, and the one that I'm going to focus on this talk is the vulnerable households one. So some major findings from the review. The term hard to reach is really commonly used in and out of the energy sector. It comes from the health, education, and social service sectors, and many of the publications in those sectors not only hone in on hard to reach definitions and valid criticisms of them, but also various engagement strategies and sampling approaches used to better reach them. This is not what our literature review focused on. We just focused on the actual audiences and target behaviors. Particular care needs to be taken to keep any value judgment or one-sided perspective of the hard-to-reach audience being at fault out of any efforts aimed at engaging them. So many commentators argue that using an umbrella term like hard to reach implies a homogeneity within these groups that simply doesn't exist. And here are 2 examples of a UK government agency and the Californian Public Utility Commission who've been really working for a long time trying to figure out and get their head around a good definition for hard to reach energy users. And both of them, as you can see, have really termed the definitions around the barriers that they face. But I really like this quote, which comes from a paper by Simmons of Manchurians who are regarded as hard to reach. And Kelly exclaimed, "Hard to reach?" I can't talk like a Manchurian, unfortunately. We're not hard to reach. We're right here. They are the ones who are hard to reach, which puts the onus back on the behavior changers who are clearly not understanding the right way of engaging the people that they're actually trying to reach. And so better understanding and characterizing these audiences, the barriers, but also more importantly, their needs, as well as including volunteer representatives from those communities or trusted middle actors in those communities, is really important when you're designing targeted programs. And it could go a long way to remove the stigma from labels such as hard to reach, because some people get quite upset, like Kelly here, when you call them hard to reach. So it's really important to consider the wider context and factors that actually make them hard to reach. And so here's just an example of what these wider contexts and factors are. So just, this is not an exhaustive list, but there are the external factors on the left here, which are around the climate, outdoor temperatures, energy access, affordability, various efficiency standards, regulations, subsidies, any kind of government income supports, any other interventions from different stakeholders, other energy use interactions outside the home, social relations. Lucy Middlemas wrote really amazing stuff on that, and obviously also the connection to transport and commuting, which became really important during the COVID lockdowns. Then in purple we have the kind of infrastructure and housing related factors. They're around the appliances, the dwelling size, the tenure type, is it renting versus owning, the various energy requirements, building energy efficiency, energy sources that are used, and fuel sources, etc. And then you also go into the household factors and contexts that are really important, like the demographics of the household composition, psychographics, barriers and needs of the various people behaviors. And I would also say what's really important is actually understanding household politics and how you may actually cause potentially problems if you interfere too much with them. Some other definitions to go into this idea that a lot of the hard-to-reach audiences are actually termed around the barriers they face. There are many, many different barriers, and my colleague Kim O'Sullivan will talk about it tomorrow in our special session on the hard-to-reach task, special session 8B, I think, where she goes into more depth of all the different barriers that we encountered when we did this literature review. But some overarching ones are the methods of involving them, physical barriers, technology barriers, attitudinal barriers, particularly around trust, or better, mistrust of the authorities who are trying to engage them, financial and resource problems, cultural misunderstandings, demographic data being missing, particularly around gender, age, and race. The timing of interventions, you're much more likely to get lucky in changing energy habits or routines, which are 90% of our energy behaviors, if you're doing moments of change, as they're called, like when they're moving house, or when they're buying a new appliance, or when they're having a baby, or taking in any elderly parents to care for, etc. Competing life priorities are huge barriers, particularly for vulnerable households. And then, of course, also the perception of relevance of energy efficiency. The example I gave in the healthcare sector is very obvious, because energy efficiency really isn't top of the perception of relevance to a nurse or even a building operator when they have to drop everything when there's a complaint of thermal comfort from a patient, for example. There are many alternative definitions that are often overlapping. And defining the hard-to-reach depends on who is doing the defining, what exactly they're focusing on, what they want to do in terms of engaging them. It could be around communication or messaging with them. It could be around getting them to take uptake of programs, to recruit research subjects, etc. This is all will create different hard-to-reach audiences depending on who is doing the defining and what they're actually trying to achieve. These kind of terms here are kind of problematic, I think, because they seem to, as I said, put the onus on the energy users themselves. The barriers are kind of associated on behalf of the behavior changes or implementers trying to engage them. So it's around mistrusting authorities, or it's out of their remit, jurisdiction, or the people refuse to engage. Some of the definitions, however, I think are better. They're often just flip side or differently worded of some of the other ones. They seem to put the onus more on the behavior changes rather than the energy users, and how they need to do more to identify, find, and engage those energy users in ways that actually make sense to them. And these terms, the issues revolve around a lack of data or knowledge of these audiences' barriers and needs, where how they can find them, or the difficulty in sampling them. And then there are some terms that actually refer to the homes or the physical infrastructure. However, there are some clear overlaps between those and the residents living in those homes. For example, socio-demographic and economic indicators that can indicate that those who are living in hard-to-treat or hard-to-heat homes are often hard to reach. For example, rural elderly, renters, low-income households. And in addition, those homes are also not targeted by most behavior changes because they're kind of a bit in the too hard basket, which then also makes the households hard to reach. So vulnerable households, most people think of them as low-income households, people living in energy poverty, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. Low-income households are often less hard to reach. There's often already very targeted programs aimed at reaching them. And there are a lot of other households living in vulnerable circumstances that may not be captured when you're just using an income denominator to target them. A general rule is that the more intersectionalities of vulnerabilities compound, the harder to reach a household and audience group will get. Rental households are obviously in general very hard to reach, and not just the renters but also the landlords. They're both hard to reach groups. They have different barriers. Power imbalance is a huge issue. The split incentive issue is a huge issue, and this is 60% of residential buildings and over 50% of commercial buildings that are renters. So this is a huge hard to reach group that is often falling through the cracks with the various programs that are trying to target those kind of households. This is something else that I think became much more important and obvious during the COVID lockdowns, and it's something there's very, very little research on, and that is home-based small businesses or micro businesses. The small SMEs make up 97% or more of all businesses in the world. There's very little research on them. They're generally regarded as the hardest to reach group. And then those home-based sole contractors or traders and businesses with 0 to 9 employees, their energy use is often not captured under commercial energy use, and so particularly with lockdown, this would have contributed quite significantly to their residential bills, only some of which may have been offset with the reduced transport costs. We know that there have been massive impacts of COVID-19 on small businesses and small business owners. And so this is something that really needs to be studied in much more depth when we're talking about vulnerable energy users. So other vulnerable households that we identified in our work, not based on income, around the factor of isolation, we broke them up. And that includes being isolated from energy efficiency and behavioral interventions that are targeted, for example, exclusively at low-income households. So there are some around geographical isolation, around gender, race, and health-based isolation, various minorities, societal isolation, stigmatized and criminalized and illegitimized people. For example, quite a lot of behavior changes going like, why would we look at the homeless? They're not energy users, but they actually are. There are only 5% of homeless who are chronically homeless. 95% of them are either transitory or in some way of intermediate homelessness where they're still staying with family or friends or in and out of shelters. And then there's age-based isolation as well, both towards the elderly, but also the very young or pregnant women or single parents with young children. Again, most of these have been hit really hard with COVID-19. So here are some problems with the literature. Jessel et al. Wrote a really good paper around this in 2019. We simply don't consider the right things to focus on. We need to target the intersectionalities of multiple vulnerabilities and prioritize these energy users over just the low-income target group. We need to decide on terminology and metrics to identify and characterize these energy users better. We need to stop working in silos and instead undertake cross-country systemic investigations into the underlying structural issues causing energy inequity and injustice. And basically, if you're a person of color, a non-labor immigrant, a non-native speaker who rents as a low-income earner and suffering from ill health, you're very likely going to be extremely hard to reach through normal programs and interventions. And this is one example actually that I found when we looked at the Swedish experience. Sweden was mostly interested in high income earners and high consumers. And when I did the literature review and looked at the Swedish data, I actually found there is a section of at least 250,000 people living in Sweden that fall exactly under this group: non-labor, elderly, immigrants, don't speak Swedish as a first language, low income, renting, kind of falling through the cracks and living in quite extreme energy poverty there. So there are also a lot of different definitions around energy, fuel poverty, or these other ones that we're using in different countries, like energy burden, energy hardship, energy deprivation, energy precariousness. Energy poverty is broadly understood as the inability of a household to achieve sufficient energy services due to a combination of access, affordability, energy efficiency of housing and appliances and needs. And in the UK, it was termed, or still is commonly termed, fuel poverty. Energy in many other countries, official definitions is around monitoring the scale of the problem. Previously, the term fuel poverty has been understood as a distinct and smaller subset of energy poverty. Fuel poverty has typically been used in developed countries, as I said, particularly in the UK. The focus has been on affordability, particularly for adequate heating. Energy poverty was around describing a lack of access to energy, as well as affordability, particularly in developing countries, as a result of inadequate basic infrastructure. But we're now talking about more useful international comparisons that could be made when we're considering energy poverty as a total concept encompassing access and affordability for achieving adequate energy services, and that we view it through a vulnerability lens. And so quite a bit of the literature has now been looking at understanding energy vulnerability and looking at the previous gap between fuel poverty and energy poverty, and looking at energy poverty instead as like being considered as a global problem with these wider definitions. So energy poverty and energy vulnerability require different metrics for definition and different measures to tackle them, but many of them will overlap just to make things more complicated. In the EU, poverty is based on computing household income adjusted with an equivalence scale. The number is then assigned to each household member and compared with a poverty line. Most often that's placed at 60% of the median equivalent income in a given country. The UK government changed the initial definition from fuel poverty by Brenda Boardman to low income, high cost definition, where a household is considered to be in fuel poverty if the residents have fuel costs that are above average of the national median level, and where they're likely to spend that amount, they would be left with a residual income below the poverty line. But it may be better to actually measure that instead by a social deprivation index, like we're starting to do in New Zealand, especially to derive comparable data between the countries. And then, of course, we also need to take inequality into account. For example, the US is using more electricity than the next 20 largest countries in the world. But then, of course, even within the US, there's massive inequality between the highest and lowest income earners, with the highest ones using up to four times more than the lowest one. And lastly, we also need to look taking care when we're using terms such as energy inequality and equity and injustice, because they mean quite different things. They really can't be mixed up. The Vermont Energy Investment Company, I put the report title down there, actually wrote a really good report where they looked at the state of equity measurement in the clean industry in the clean energy industry in the US, and they found that energy efficiency programs, when they were targeted at all, have disproportionately focused on groups defined by income, usually low income, and very little attention has been given to groups defined by other demographic characteristics. And I really recommend to prioritize the collection of information in the communities perceived to be disadvantaged historically. Something that has not been common practice in the energy sector, as energy efficiency professionals, we usually stay away from trying to make value judgment around complex social issues such as structural racism, the ongoing impacts of centuries of slavery and colonization. But unfortunately, these are usually the underlying structural factors that cause a lot of the energy injustice issues that we urgently need to deal with if we really want to get serious about a just energy transition to stop runaway climate change. And so I'm a little bit over my time. So I'm just going to go through these quickly. I already talked about them yesterday. One of the important things that we found was that the audience size estimates were a lot larger than the 1/3 of energy users that we originally thought. It's more like 2/3, if not 3/4 of energy users. The COVID-19 impact is massive and has pushed a whole new tranche of energy users into this vulnerable arena. And the biggest research gaps are around understanding their needs and psychographics, and also collecting the relevant demographic data. And so they're not just hard to reach, they're underserved and under-researched by us, and we need to do a lot more work around the issues of energy justice, equity, and stigma in particular. I'd also like to very quickly just plug that we're doing a cross-country case study comparison right now in year 2, and we're really looking for more case studies in this field from other countries. So please contact me if you have any good pilots or case studies. And we're also looking at getting some research pilots co-funded. Thank you to our participants, and thanks for listening to me. And I saw some questions coming in. So Adriana, shall I leave it up to you to moderate that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much, C. Really, really interesting content there. And yes, please, anyone who has questions for C, type them in the chat, and we've got several minutes to discuss them. And we do have one already from Renee. And Renee says that at the moment they're working on core values that people have, like autonomy and competence, and people need to fulfill these core values in order for them to participate in, I guess, the energy market and support. So if, for instance, people aren't able to read, then the approach needs to be different than written material. And the question is, do you take these core values into account in your approach? So yes. Values like autonomy and competence?
Yes, absolutely. This is one of the good ways about that research process that we're following. It will guide you to the right questions to try and find the right answers, because instead of starting with an engagement strategy, which is what most energy efficiency and behavioral programs do, they have an engagement strategy that worked in the past with a different audience, and they're usually just replicating a similar strategy. I find that is really problematic. And instead, what we do is we spend a lot of time in that initial discover phase, where we're really looking at, I might just go back to that slide, where we're looking at a very broad landscape and stakeholder analysis, getting the right stakeholders around the table, really trying to get the audiences that we're thinking about targeting, figuring out who the right target audiences actually are. And then you go into that, oops, I don't actually have it on here. Just went through all of that for nothing, sorry. And then you actually make sure that you spend a lot of time on the definition phase, where you actually understand the psychographics, particularly of your audience groups. And instead of just understanding the barriers, which is there's so much literature on barriers, almost everything with hard to reach is seen through the lens of barriers. I found very, very little literature that actually did any needs assessment of these audiences and with these audiences. And I think that would actually help us a lot more if we'd see it through that flip side of what do they need, rather than just what are barriers to their engagement. And I think these issues that you describe here, particularly around, for example, literacy, are definitely some that you should be actually able to capture in that phase before you then get to the designing the content and delivery mechanisms of your engagement strategies. And I think it would actually, even though it takes more time and maybe costs a little bit more to do these pilots in this kind of staged phases, I think ultimately it will show you'll get more data, you'll get the data you need to design it in a way that makes sense. You can prototype it with your audiences, and that will actually make it easier to reiterate and define and refine it and evaluate ongoing, including with your stakeholders and your audiences, if you're still on the right track. And it also means you then be able to scale it up and actually measure persistence, which is often the thing that we don't do in behavioral programs. Sorry, that was a really long, convoluted answer to your question, but yes, absolutely. And I think there's another one. Yeah, sorry.
No, that's great. Thanks, Ian. I guess as a follow-on to that, I was going to ask, because a lot of countries are maybe in the early stages of energy poverty becoming a priority and kind of getting to grips with how they tackle that. So yeah, my question was going to be like, what do you think are the best stages? And I think you've answered that quite well, that it's so important to stay in the discover phase and then the definitions phase and the needs assessment. Is that a accurate summary of?
Yeah, I honestly think it's a big mistake to jump straight to engagement strategies, even if they've worked in the past, because it's such a complex system. And what I said before about the jar of mayonnaise is really true, especially when you work with human beings. There is no answer, no one size fits all model or theory or strategy that's going to get you there. And if you don't really try and collect the quantitative and qualitative data that you need to understand what you're actually doing and spend a lot of time listening. And I think that's really important. I find that energy efficiency, and the literature backed me up in that, I find that energy efficiency is a very middle class, white and often male perspective. It's very flavored by economics and engineering, which is what most of our policymakers and program managers are trained in. It has that idea that it's a complicated issue that has a solution, that you just need enough computing power for. It has a linear kind of A to B to C kind of way, and it's just not what reality is like. And I think when you work with these vulnerable energy users in particular, you've got to spend a lot more time up front listening and actually getting out of your idea of how the world works and understanding how their world works.
Yeah, indeed. And do you think trialing your approach is, if you've done, you've gone off, understood the characteristics of your audience, or you think you have, is it important to trial? Because I guess I'm thinking maybe you think you understand your audience, but in fact, you've got it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the great examples is when you're trying to work with Maori in New Zealand, our indigenous community. They're fantastic, and there's so much richness there and cultural richness, but there's also so much cultural misunderstanding. And one of that comes from you kind of talk to the token Maori and you think you now have the Maori perspective. And as every single Maori will tell you, if you talk to one of us, every other one is going to disagree with it. Like there's no such thing as like a cultural perspective of one people. Like you do need to do a lot more work. And like I think Renee said it really nicely, sometimes you need to slow down to be able to speed up later on. And I think that is really true. And those initial listening and actually hearing what the structural issues are, and sometimes they are very painful, and sometimes they cause us to feel white guilt and oscillate wildly between white saviorism and white guilt, both of which is extremely unhelpful to those communities and just puts more onus on them having to educate us and having to hold our hands, getting us through these fragile states. And that's just it's what's happening, and it's good that it's at least happening now and we're not just ignoring it, but we need to find a way, because the world is burning up and there are so many people really suffering, especially now with the pandemic. We need to find a way of actually getting them to help co-create and actually take the lead on some of these interventions as well.
Yeah, definitely. And the next question is, I guess, because this session is about collaboration and trying to enhance knowledge exchange and support between the energy practitioner communities and academia. Because when we're on the ground delivering programs, it's often hard to do a thorough research into the characteristics of your target group, or you might be going from just experience or past data, and just because you don't have the time. I mean, it's saying that by that point, it's too late and you have to go a few steps back and do that. Or is there a way that the knowledge and research that exists within academia can somehow help energy practitioners overcome that issue?
Yeah, I think it can. And I think Karen actually made a really good point in her kind of comment here that I agree with. I was a policymaker for 7 years, so I totally understand, and I really struggled with social science language and social science publications to begin with. Because I came from biology, and it's a very different way of writing, and this use of language and this very flowery language, and it makes it quite dense to read. As a policymaker, you have your own kind of language that you're used to, which is very much more dry. It's not, the translation between the two is not always great. I think that is one of the reasons why Elizabeth Shove and practice theory, I always say it's really great in theory, but it's actually really hard to apply in practice, especially when you're a policymaker. And they've tried, I think, for 10 years now, figuring out how they can apply it in practice, and they're still struggling with it. And that's because these are, unfortunately, these really complex issues that do not have these simple, straightforward, linear answers. And it does involve some of that slow work where it's also not paying scientists or consultants to tell you what the answer is. That is not going to get you any. The amount of money that's been spent on reports by consultants that have not done anything is staggering. And so I really think that trying to get this more multi-stakeholder and richer, more complex perspective into the room, and figuring out where the conflict points are, where the mandates really are fighting against each other, but also where the overlaps are, where good relationships are already there, and really building on that. It's a slower way, but I think it's the only way, really. If you want to have success in this, because nobody individually in a silo has all the capacity, the funding, the resources, the experience, and the understanding of the energy users that you're targeting. It's just there's no person who can design this in a silo.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So we have to go back to the main session in shortly, but we have one last question from Karen. So I don't know if you're able to quickly give your thoughts on this.
I kind of answered that now. I also realized we missed one from Anna, which was work on hard to reach and vulnerables in micro enterprises or SMEs. And in the lit review, we do have a whole chapter on that. There is not much. There really isn't much, and I really hope that we get more of that work funded, particularly on those home-based micro businesses, which I think is actually a really large percentage. There's very few countries who have done any audience size estimates of them. I found one in the UK, and they actually suggest that 25% of small to medium businesses are run out of residences. So that obviously would have had a huge impact with the COVID lockdowns, and I haven't really seen work that has looked into how that has been offset, how the lack of transport and commuting costs have been offset with the increases in residential energy, but also with the loss of work, because obviously if you're a tradesperson and you spend your whole day driving around seeing clients, and now you can't do that because of COVID. If you're not a key essential worker, then that would have had a massive impact. And it may have actually thrown, I showed that slide before of the definitions between the different types of poor, and there are the twice poor, which are income and asset poor. Then there are the ones who are just income poor but not asset, but they're asset rich. And then there are the vulnerable poor, and they're actually the ones, I think, right now in the so-called middle class, where they have been living like a middle class the way it was in the 50s, but that doesn't really exist anymore in most countries. And so instead they have been living from paycheck to paycheck, and now with COVID, suddenly when they were furloughed, or when there was any kind of stop in their employment, they fell very quickly into a highly vulnerable state. And I think there's a lot of research around the stigma and around the difficulty that those people will have facing the welfare state and figuring out how to get support, which people who have grown up or lived in poverty for a long time may be better at dealing with in some ways, And so, I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, C. That was excellent and great content. And We now will leave this breakout room, we'll go to the main room and then rejoin breakout session 4C main session to go through the concluding remarks. So again, yeah, thank you very much and see you back in the main room.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay, well, I was in the session 4C1, so the session on behavioural insights in energy policy, so led by Dr. Gerdin De Vries, who gave us a very inspiring presentation. And I think we had about 20 people in the end in our group, seemed to keep going up, which was really, really great that we had so many people interested. And during the presentation, we learned a lot. We looked at different types of energy policy and why psychology can be so important for energy policy and behavioural energy goals, and specifically looked into framing and green nudging. So Gerdin gave a very nice introduction to herself, about her background, and mentioned a virtual lab that she initiated. It's a safe and safe environment for risky research, as she described it. We talked about insights in behaviour of electric charging of vehicles, and that although you might be in favour of having an electric car, you might not have yet gone out there and bought one. And also that it's difficult to change people's behaviour in that respect, that you may say that it's a good idea to charge your vehicle during the evening, and people might be willing to do that, but as Gerdin described, if it's raining outside, or if you're sitting watching a really good film or something, you might not feel like going outside and charging your car. So there's a kind of gap in thinking what's the right thing to do and actually doing it. Also, we looked at different policy instruments and classic instruments and new instruments, which are the ones that use behavioural insights. We also, let me see, behavioural energy policy goals. Is it to reduce carbon footprint, or acceptance, or adaptation? Looking at different goals, and we had an example of a goal of energy policy to stimulate electric vehicle charging. Is it reduction of CO2, or is it acceptance, or is it adaptation? And she put this question forward to the audience, and the majority thought that it was more somewhat adaptation, so adaptation to new technology and using different energy sources. What else? Yes, on the behavioural intervention side, she talked about framing, that it's very important to have the right framing in place, which can have an influence on perception, and also on nudging. So nudging, a kind of push, a little push in a certain direction, that this is also extremely important in energy policy making. And let me see. Yeah, and her final note was to take responsibility yourselves. She also referred attention to an IEA report, very interesting. And she offered to collaborate with anybody who's really interested in the subject to get in touch with Gerdin. She's very open for more cooperation. And please, Gerdin, if you want to add anything, feel free to do so. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. No, you did a great job by summarizing it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so maybe I should give the floor to the next group to summarize their discussion, unless there's any questions. Then I give the floor to Edouard Toulouse.
So in our session on sufficiency, we had two inspiring presentation and quite complementary. So first we had Eric from ADEME, who told us how an institution like an energy agency can embark in sufficiency. And he had several activities to report. So for instance, first and foremost, ADEME worked on definitions and terminology of sufficiency to make it clear what they were talking about, and also has set up some observatories to monitor sufficiency. So observatories, for example, on fuel poverty and sufficiency, and also on weak signals. So to track what kind of changes in behaviors and lifestyles could be monitored towards sufficiency. ADEME has also worked on long-term energy scenarios, and some of them are including sufficiency assumptions. So it was interesting to see that the scenario with the strongest sufficiency assumption is at the moment the only one that meets the French target of halving final energy demand by 2050. So that's quite challenging.
I'm sorry, this is Antoinette and Edouard. I think you need to go to the main room because we are nearing the end, and you should have been there a quarter ago. Okay?
Sorry?
Come back to the main room then.
They are in the main room, Antoinette. I think you are too. So
we're presenting the conclusions from the breakouts, and we are introducing the conclusions from the breakout 2.
Okay, go ahead, Edouard.
Can I go on, please? Okay. So also Eric told us something interesting and surprising, that in the research that ADEME supports, so for example, thesis on energy, a quarter of them in the last years were about sufficiency topics. And last, also ADEME is working on communication and information tools on sufficiency. And the second presentation we had from Joanne Wade insisted on the role that public authorities have to play to enable sufficiency-oriented lifestyles. So governance is very important in building a consensus on where we want to be, what kind of sufficiency society we want, and also how we can decide on how to reach there. And she insisted that sufficiency is a concept that gives a very interesting framework to think both about excess consumption, which is clearly present in our Western societies, but also how to better deal with fuel poverty, because in some way poor people are also forced to make some balances and trade-offs in their lifestyles, and so also implement sufficiency. But with sufficiency as a framework, we can discuss energy justice. So how to make sure we answer everybody's needs while remaining in under the planetary constraints. And last, she gave us some hope by showing us how sufficiency could be accelerated in the post-COVID recovery if we manage to have public authorities consider it more in the way they are rebuilding societies. Unfortunately, we were not able to have question and answers at the end of the session. Apologies for that. But of course, if some of the participants want to have more information about these various activities, they can contact us individually or ask questions further during the conference. Thank you.
Thanks, Edouard. I'll quickly summarize what we discussed in breakout session 3, where we talked about vulnerable energy consumers and engaging with them. So we're nearly the end, so I'll just make 3 points. So aside from those who fall under the definitions of energy poverty and vulnerable consumers, we learned that there are many others who are in vulnerable circumstances, but who fall outside of these definitions and can be considered hard to reach. We learned that if people have multiple vulnerabilities, these can compound, and that makes people even harder to reach. And not much is known about how these vulnerabilities interrelate at the moment, but that is something that is very important to be aware of and for future research. We learned that understanding the characteristics of the group that you're trying to reach is so important, and it can't really be skipped if you want to successfully reach people with your programs. And so countries, organizations delivering programs to vulnerable consumers should really consider the discover phase, the define phase, and do a thorough needs assessment so they understand their audience. And finally, in terms of future collaboration, there are opportunities for energy practitioners and academics and researchers to collaborate on this and to help each other, but with the understanding that the academics aren't the experts that have the answers and end of story, but it's a much more collaborative, maybe slower process, but more impactful. Thanks very much. Back to you, Antoinette.
I'm not sure if Antoinette's still with us, so maybe Adriana, you could just show the last slide to promote our catalogue of best practices, just to show the link. You got that slide? See that? This is some links for further information. We've been developing a catalogue of best practices related to behavioural insights, so with examples from about 13 countries, about 30 best practices in total, and it's now available on our ENR website. That might be interesting for you to have a look at. And also, we'd like to suggest the idea of using the ENR Behaviour Change Working Group as a platform for further collaboration. So I'd like to invite you to get in touch, especially with Irmeli, who's chairing the group. And I just saw a message in the chat that we need to close. Antoinette, are you with us? Or Irmeli?
Yeah, I'm there. So,
great.
Sorry about this technical issue. Yeah, we have to go. If there are any questions that are not answered, we will take care of it after the conference. And we would thank everybody and hope you had a good workshop and wish you a very good remaining part of the conference. And that's with those words, I think we have to leave. Okay.